My name is Tyson Barker, and I am also for the first time in Lisbon. Thank you so much for the invitation from the Social Liberal Movement and from the Dahrendorf Forum. This is actually the second Dahrendorf event that I've done this month. The last one was in London, but it's a perfect topic.
Yeah.
So the professor said a lot of the things that I wanted to say, so I'll try to keep it real short and tight so we can get to some discussion. When the internet first became a real integral part of our democracy, about 10 to 12 years ago, the sense was that this was always going to be a value positive. There was the Obama election experience in 2008. There was the Arab Spring in its initiation, this idea that this was a way, as was mentioned, for citizens to circumvent incumbent entrenched interests and get their voices heard. There was the Maidan protests in 2013 and 2014 where citizens in Ukraine came out into the street, organized on Facebook to say, we want our country to move towards a European future. So there was always this perception that the role of the internet was going to be positive. But the truth is the internet and digital technology is value neutral. And as we become more aware of that, we're losing somewhat of our innocence. And what I want to talk about, we talked a little bit about the positive side, the empowering side of the internet. I want to talk a little bit about the dark side, which is something that, of course, we're much more aware of today. And I'm going to use Russia as a state actor and its involvement in digital democracies at home and abroad as a kind of case study. Not because Russia is the only country pursuing these kind of activities. There are other state actors and non-state actors, including populist parties, but because Russia provides so many examples. So just to start, I want to talk about a speech that Vladimir Putin gave at the UN General Assembly in 2015. He talked about the idea of the state itself. And he said, we have to restore the role of the state to the areas it's been destroyed. The state should be a mediator in all aspects of public life and should be a mediator in all aspects of international life. And of course, that on its face sounds very benign. But essentially what he was saying, and it's the opposite of the Dahrendorf Forum, and this is where the dark side comes in with these instruments online, is that openness is weakness. And of course, as liberals, we think that openness is a strength. That's where we get our resilience. This is where we have public discourse, that kind of stuff. But for Putin and like-minded actors and authoritarians, openness is weakness, and it's something that can be exploited. And of course, we saw this in the 2016 election, but there are many other examples. There was a referendum in the Netherlands on Ukraine's movement towards Europe, which was heavily influenced by fake news, by bots, by trolls, by manufactured discourse online. There was, of course, attempts at hack and leaks with the DNC, with the Democratic National Committee in the United States, but also similar attempts in France in their 2017 election. And many examples of fake news. From Lisa, I don't know if you guys have heard of the Lisa case in Germany. It was a story that came out that a German of Russian descent had been kidnapped by refugees and abused. And it proved to be false, but this was propagated both in Russian media RT and also online in bots and trolls, and eventually made its way into the public discourse in Germany, including the Russian foreign minister who brought this up in 2016. But the first thing that I think we should focus on, I'm going to focus on 5 aspects very quickly, is the threat is evolving. So any conversations that we have today about the threat are probably based on experiences from 3 years ago. And that's not the situation today. In this language of cyber, we are talking about 0-day vulnerabilities. So those are the vulnerabilities that we aren't even aware that they exist. The known unknowns. Right now, fake news, bots, these kind of things are in some ways known knowns, right? We know that these things exist, and we're much more aware of them today than we were, say, 5 years ago. But there are new ones emerging. I mean, I would say there are 4 that we know exist, and I think everybody in this room knows. Hack and leak operations, trolls and bots, fake news, and hate speech. We're all aware of these things. But what are the things that are on the horizon? Deep fakes, artificial intelligence-generated videos and voice, and we've started to see this in the United States. Attacks on government-adjacent institutions. So not just having hack and leaks from governments or from parties, but from think tanks, and from individuals. So not just politicians, but maybe the politicians' kids, because those are sources of vulnerabilities, stuff like that. So we cannot be thinking about what's happened in the past necessarily. We need to be thinking about anticipating what technology could make possible in the future. And AI is an example. Virtual reality, that's something that we need to be thinking about. Its impact on democracy midterm. Quantum computing and its ability to break all of your passwords in an instant so that your information can be exposed just like that. These are things that we need to talk about. And the second reality I think we need to talk about when talking about the information space is it's not always about content, it's about intent. So, we talk a lot about the Russian intervention in the United States, for example, and there's some focus on the Podesta leaked emails and this kind of stuff and what was in those emails. But we have to ask ourselves, what is the intent of the leaker? What is the intent of those generating fake news? And if we do that, we will become more informed citizens and more informed participants in our democracy. The third reality I want to say is it's not always about security, it's often about adjacency. So this is something that comes in, it's not just a technological problem, it's an anthropological problem. We think about, all this technology is so great, it's bringing us closer together, and we should make sure that our systems are secure for our governments, for our banks, for this kind of stuff. But what about our neighbors, our friends? What about the personal conversations we're having with our family, with our kids? These are sources of vulnerability. And also sources of vulnerability for fake news and fraudulent information to get into the bloodstream of our political discourse. So something that I call information laundering. A lot of times for us, we'll think, there's these far right populist or far left populist propagating conspiracy theories that are just ridiculous on their face. Just to give you an example, that Barack Obama was born in Kenya. This generated somewhere. We don't know the origins of this conspiracy theory, but then it works its way through the system. So, it gets some traction on Twitter, gets some traction on Facebook, gets picked up by news outlets that are considered fringe, so maybe RT or InfoWars, and slowly makes its way into mainstream discourse. And the biggest upshot for that movement into mainstream discourse are influencers, are validators, are YouTube personalities, are people like the head of InfoWars, and sometimes politicians themselves. The fourth reality I want to say is social media, and getting back to talking about the threats that we know, is actually designed in some ways to hurt democracy. Of course it's designed to help democracy. We can get a lot of information out there without intermediaries. But we know that these platforms don't cost money. The way we're paying is with data and advertising. And that's one of the reasons, and we can talk about this in the discussion, the most cutting edge technology that's emerging in artificial intelligence and virtual reality and all these kind of things isn't happening in the defense sector, people will say that, or isn't happening by government funded programs. It's actually happening in social media, and the reason it's happening is to get your eyeballs to pay more attention. It's driven by advertising. So you don't have this thing that costs money, but they want your data, they want your engagement, and that's the piece. It's all about engagement. That is the crux of social media's model. They want your eyeballs. I know a lot of people here are probably looking at their phones as we speak. This is the development of behavioral patterns which could lead to addiction. But the idea is they want to get you engaged. And what gets people more engaged than anything else? What works on your brain more than anything else? Emotionally laden content, polarizing content, and content that reaffirms our sense of identity, validating content. And a lot of that is fake news. So fake news, hate speech, hack and leaks, these kind of things are just the kind of things that will up engagement. And these are just, in the design of social media, they're just the perfect, they're like catnip, they're the perfect elements for social media. So the last question I have, or the last reality I have, is what can we do to protect our democracies, is the question here is. What can we do to, in a kind of paradox, harden openness? Well, a lot of them were just brought up, but I'll just mention a couple. First, citizen awareness. And we're already becoming aware, we're becoming much better readers of news, fake news, much better judges of what kind of the intent is behind hack and leaks and these kind of interventions. But we also need to make sure that we have independent and credible institutions, both those that can do fact-checking, but also more broadly in our society, judicial systems, media, political parties, all these kind of things. We need to invest in these institutions to make sure that they remain legitimate, because these are the institutions that will be able to serve as the antibodies against this kind of leveling effect of nothing is true and anything is possible. And just to get back to that point about, it's not about content, it's about intent. In the United States, when Russia was interfering with the US election, it wasn't to get Donald Trump elected. It was to undermine the legitimacy of the democratic process itself, so that everybody would question whether or not it was a legitimate election. There are other tools that we can use. We can use, sanctions if it's a state actor, asset freezes. These are kind of traditional tools, and you're seeing them more and more in the United States and in Europe. In fact, last week, Europe said that it was going to put more sanctions on state actors that engaged in hybrid warfare. We can engage in cyber operations against these actors that are pushing these kind of interventions. And we can have, and I didn't talk so much about election systems themselves, but they're obviously a point of attack. They're critical infrastructure. They need to be protected, and they need to be monitored. And we can set up systems like through the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, the OSCE, to have cyber election observers, to certify the integrity of election systems. So these are just a couple of the ideas that I have, but I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay,
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.